So, the UEFA Champions League last 16 draw has just taken place, and the surprise package Bodo Glimt have got the draw they probably wanted, and that's Sporting Lisbon in the last 16. So, they avoided Manchester City and have a great chance of getting through to the quarter-finals. Now, Bodo Glimt's success isn't a one-off this season. They were Europa League semi-finalists just last season, and they have also been to the quarterfinals of the Europa Conference League in 2021-22, losing to Roma over two legs, although they did beat them 6-1 in the group stage. So Bodo Glimt have had an amazing kind of couple of years. Since 2019, they've been champions of Norway 4 times and runners-up 3 times. But what I kind of feel with this is, while it's a wonderful story, it really takes away from how lopsided the Champions League is and has been becoming for over 20 odd years, ever since they started allowing second place teams from the bigger nations to enter the competition. And I think what Bodo Glimt's success does is it kind of shields us to what is really happening. Because obviously it's a great story, don't get me wrong, and Bodo Glimt deserve all the praise. But for Bodo Glimt to Norway, there is a ceiling, and usually it's a glass ceiling. This time I think it's a steel ceiling that I don't think they'll ever break through. So while Bodo Glimt have done amazing for Norway, the problem is countries like England, Italy, Spain, Germany, France have too many clubs in Europe for Norwegian football and many others to really make a serious dent on those nations. So what I'm talking about here is the coefficients in terms of how they decide how many teams should be in Europe from a particular country, and it's all about obviously wins and draws. You get points for this, but one of the kind of key things is, like for the UEFA Champions League, points are provided for each team who is qualified for the group stage, for example. So England, had 6 entrants this year, 25-26. So each of those earned points, for England's coefficient. Now, for Norwegian football, they didn't have anyone in the group who walked straight into the group stage. Bodo Glimt and Brann had to both qualify. Now, Bodo Glimt, of course, qualified, but Brann didn't. Now, obviously, the more teams you've got in European competition, the more chances you've got of getting extra points, wins and draws, etc. So while Bodo Glimt, it's incredibly unlikely, but let's just say they went on to win the Champions League this season, probably English clubs, Spanish clubs, potentially French clubs and maybe German, will probably actually amass more points because they've got more entrants and the chance to earn, more coefficient points. And the coefficients is also taken from the last 5 seasons. So while while Bodo Glimt have done well in the last couple of seasons, as I mentioned, Europa League semi-finalists, Europa Conference League quarter-finalists, and now last 16 of the Champions League, no other Norwegian team has made, much of an impact. So while Bodo Glimt will obviously, have done well for Norway and might move them up to the above the coefficients, a couple of places, it just shows that, they're not Norway as a whole, and for many other nations, particularly those who have only got 3 places or 2 places in the Champions League or Europe in general, you're not going to ever impact English, Italian, Spanish, German and French clubs. I know Italy's having a bit of a bad spell at the moment, but as I say, they're still going to have 3 or 4 or even potentially 5 participants depending on what happens next season. So it's unlikely that you'll ever see a massive change from Italy. As I say, it's taken over the last 5 years. So should this take away from Bodo Glimt's success this season? No, it doesn't. But what it essentially means is you're always going to have teams from England, Italy, Spain, Germany and France qualifying for the last 16, qualifying for the quarterfinals. And this is where the Champions League changes when they started introducing the second place teams. This is why it's always favoured the bigger leagues. Now, it's interesting to note that if you go back to the European Champions Club Cup, Norwegian clubs between 1955 to 1992 rarely made an impact. They were more often knocked out at the first round. So it wasn't seeded then. So obviously it was just league champions. So they could be drawn against anyone. But only on a couple of occasions did they get to the second round. And again, they didn't progress any further. But let's put that into perspective, because Bodo Glimt this season, of their first 6 group games, they drew 3 and lost 3. So under the old format, even probably the original format of the Champions League, where in the group stage they probably wouldn't have made it at all up until this expanded league phase. Now, I always think the expanded league phase, this Swiss model is for the bigger clubs, because if they have a bad season, they've got 8 games to rectify their Champions League campaign, because essentially you just got to finish in the top 24. So obviously on one side of the coin you say, oh, but it's helped Bodo Glimt, but it kind of shows that to me that if you're going to draw 3 and lose 3 of your first 6 games, I know they then beat Man City and Atletico Madrid, but should a team like that, and I'm not just talking Bodo Glimt here, I'm talking Benfica and a number of other clubs who lost 3 on 4 games, should they even be in a knockout phase of the Champions League? I know it's unlikely that Bodo Glimt will win the competition, but to not win your first 6 games and still be in with a good shout of getting to the quarterfinals, I think this is everything wrong with the Champions League. Now, this isn't the first time Norway have been in this position. So in the 1990s, in the early years of the Champions League, Rosenborg actually created quite a stir, because in the 96-97 season, they came second in a group behind Porto, but ahead of AC Milan and Gothenburg, and they qualified, and they were knocked out in the quarter-final. And then in 97-98, they did finish second again behind Real Madrid, but this time they didn't advance. Because of a change, only the best second-place teams would qualify, and Rosenborg were not one of those teams, even though they finished 2 points behind eventual winners Real Madrid, and were the only team in the tournament that season to beat Real Madrid. Now, Brann also reached the quarterfinals of the Cup Winners' Cup in 96-97, and Vålerenga did the same in 98-99. And Norway were in both the 94 and 98 World Cups. And England fans will remember, or should remember, Norway in particular in the qualification for the 94 World Cup. So Norwegian football, this isn't, Bodo Glimt isn't the first time. I think the difference here is Rosenborg dominated the Norwegian league during that period, whereas Bodo Glimt aren't dominating Norway. But this is where the other problem comes in for Bodo Glimt, and again, this steel ceiling, because the way that money is proportioned across Europe now in terms of which leagues it sits in and etc. is Bodo Glimt are going to face, a couple massive challenges here, because while they will get the money from, the Champions League run, etc., where the other Norwegian clubs will not, they're only going to be able to attract a certain quality of player, because they're not going to rival the Premier League, La Liga, the Bundesliga, Serie A. They're probably not going to rival the Eredivisie or any of the other middling leagues in Europe. So the problem is they're going to only attract a certain player. They're not going to attract the best. The second kind of thing here is, even if, I haven't seen it yet with Bodo Glimt. We've had Matthias Jorgensen leave Bodo Glimt for Blackburn Rovers in the Championship for £4 million, but they'd only just signed him, back in the summer. But what will happen is, if Bodo Glimt continue to overperform, then Europe's clubs, and I'm not talking necessarily about the biggest, but other clubs will come picking, because Norwegian football won't be able to offer the wages of, even the middling clubs of Europe. Now, this may have always been a potential issue in the old European Champions Club Cup era or the early years of the Champions League. But talent was distributed a little bit more evenly then. It doesn't mean that it was an equal playing field, but now it's become so skewed because of the way the Champions League has fed the bigger leagues and helped them, cement their place, at Europe's top table, that even clubs like the Eredivisie, Ajax and PSV and Feyenoord, all former European champions. The Eredivisie has gone through a phase of being, a decent league in Europe to probably the 2000s and the early 2010s, where quality players were still coming through the Eredivisie, but then obviously moving on to bigger clubs. To now, the Eredivisie it's declined in quality. So for Bodo Glimt and Norwegian football, there's only so high they can go, and it's not very high before, they're just not going to go any further. Now, people will argue, but we want to see Real Madrid winning the Champions League, and we want to see Barcelona, we want to see Man City, and we want to see the big clubs winning the Champions League. But what you won't see is what happened in the European Champions Club Cup era, when through a mixture of, luck of a season, luck of a draw, and decent players before they were picked off, you won't see a Malmo from Sweden getting to the final, or a Gothenburg coming so close to reaching a final. And you're highly unlikely to see that again. So I think with Bodo Glimt's success, it's brilliant in the short term, and it does wonders for people's view of the Champions League. But I think we kind of need to wake up and look at it and go, this is kind of wrong in a lot of levels. Just the fact that they don't, they drew 3 and lost 3 of the first 6 games. Yes, they beat Man City and Atletico Madrid to qualify, but there are a number of clubs who shouldn't be anywhere near the last 16 or even the knockout phase. If you cannot win a game in those first 6 games, at least 2 or 3, then I don't think you should be even considered. And that goes for any of the bigger teams who, like Man City last season, and PSG, Real Madrid, who don't finish in the top 8, they're losing 2 or 3 games. They should be out. This is not what a Champions League is. This is a European Super League in all but name. And the more we will be edging closer to the next time UEFA make changes. So it's brilliant that Bodo Glimt have drawn Sporting Lisbon. There is a chance for one of those 2 teams, but look at all the quarterfinal draws over the last kind of 10, 12, 15 years. There's always one team from outside, England, Italy, Spain, France, Germany, that gets through just to the quarterfinal. So 2011-12, Apoel of Cyprus got to the quarterfinal. And the trend is, if you're not one of the bigger teams from the bigger nations, the quarterfinals is the best you can do, and you're lucky to get there. Now, Bodo Glimt might surprise us and get to the Champions League semi-final. You never know. But in all likelihood, this is a one-off. It's a bit like 2003-04 when Porto and Monaco were in the final. That was a one-off. It's not been repeated, where Portuguese team has played a French team. And even then, it's just not been repeated. So while it's great for the short term, I think this is a wake-up call. And I think everyone needs to have a look at, what this really means. And, I think this just proves that we are so close to a Super League. I can't believe people still kind of champion the Champions League and think it's still a fair competition or anything like that. It is a European Super League. They are doing their best to get the smaller teams out. And while this is a success story, from a money-making perspective, I think, UEFA would probably want to see Bodo Glimt have played Man City and Sporting Lisbon to play Real Madrid, because you want to see Real Madrid, Man City in a quarterfinal, not a last 16. And this is the whole reason why the Champions League became about, because they didn't want to see the bigger teams going out too early. Well, it's almost impossible for a bigger team to go out in the groups in the league phase. So for Real Madrid or Man City to go out in the last 16, that's not going to be good, because Real Madrid and Man City want to be in the quarterfinals, and they think they deserve to be. And UEFA have fed this with all the changes, since the mid 1990s. And so, while it's a great individual story, I think this is everything that's wrong with the Champions League. So, but let me know what you think. As I say, I'm not saying Bodo Glimt, are a bad team. I think they've done wonderful, but as I say, I think it just shows the absolute how wrong it is with the current format of the UEFA Champions League, and it's only going to get worse. But let me know what you think, in below, if you kind of like what I'm kind of sharing, going through. Just obviously hit the like and subscribe. But yeah, so Bodo Glimt, Sporting Lisbon. So one of those underdogs is going to be in the quarterfinals.